She can get up from her wheelchair now, if you let her, the little boy said, his voice barely a whisper, yet cutting through the silence of the marble foyer like a blade. Thomas froze. His hand, which had been reaching for the heavy gold handle of the front door, stayed suspended in midair. Behind him, the rhythmic mechanical hum of his daughter's motorized wheelchair was the only other sound in the mansion. He turned slowly, his face a mask of cold, calculated disbelief. Standing there, next to the priceless Ming vase, was a child no older than 7, wearing a faded denim jacket and shoes that had seen too many miles. Thomas didn't ask how the boy had bypassed the state-of-the-art security system or the iron gates. He only saw a threat to the fragile, painful peace he had built around his daughter's tragedy. "Who let you in?" Thomas demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous low rumble. "If you think you can play games with my family's grief to get a handout, you've picked the wrong house. Get out before I make sure you never walk through another door in this city again. My name is Martha. I've lived many years and seen the world change from black and white to 1,000 shades of grey, but I've never seen a heart as hardened by gold as Thomas Whitmore's. Back then, I was the one who kept that house running, the one who polished the silver and saw the tears he thought he hid from everyone." Thomas wasn't always a man of stone. He was once a man of vision, a titan of an industry who believed that with enough work and enough capital, any obstacle could be moved. He had built an empire of glass and steel, thinking he was untouchable. But life has a way of reminding us that we are only breath and dust. 5 years prior, a rainy night and a patch of black ice had taken his wife's life and left his only daughter, Sarah, paralyzed from the waist down. In the years that followed, Thomas became a man possessed. He didn't pray, he bought. He flew in surgeons from Switzerland, therapists from Japan, and experimental roboticists from Germany. He spent millions on a state-of-the-art rehabilitation wing built right inside the mansion, filled with cold blue lights and humming machines. But Sarah remained in that chair, her legs as lifeless as the marble statues in the garden, and her eyes growing dimmer with every failed miracle her father tried to purchase. Thomas had closed his heart to the heavens the day the doctors told him she'd never walk again, deciding that if God wouldn't help him, he would use his wealth to become his own God. He hated weakness, he hated pity, and most of all, he hated the unexplained. Yet, as he stared at the boy in the foyer, something felt different. The air in the room seemed to vibrate, as if a localized storm was brewing between the billionaire and the intruder. The boy didn't flinch at Thomas's threat. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, a drawing that looked decades old. When Thomas caught a glimpse of the faded ink and the specific symbol sketched in the corner, the color drained from his lips, and his knees buckled just enough for him to have to lean against the doorframe for support. If you're finding this story as powerful as I, remember it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the most shocking part of this encounter was about to be revealed. Thomas stared at the drawing, a memory he had buried under layers of corporate contracts and cold logic, suddenly screaming to the surface. He looked from the paper to the two boys' calm, ancient eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, the man who owned everything felt like he knew absolutely nothing. But before Thomas could find his voice to ask where that paper came from, the boy pointed a small finger toward the hallway where Sarah was waiting, and what he said next would make every scientific law Thomas believed in crumble into dust. He hadn't just come to deliver a message, he had come to collect on a debt that Thomas thought the world had forgotten. The air in the grand foyer didn't just grow cold, it turned heavy, as if the very oxygen was being replaced by the weight of a memory Thomas had tried to incinerate years ago. "That's impossible," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking for the first time in a decade. He snatched the crumpled paper from the boy's hand, his fingers trembling so violently the parchment rattled. It was a simple sketch of a lighthouse, drawn with the unsteady hand of a child, but in the bottom right corner was a seal, a wax stamp of a small, forgotten parish from the edge of the coastline where Thomas had grown up in poverty. "My mother drew this," Thomas murmured, more to himself than the boy. "She died 30 years ago. I burned everything she owned, every letter, every drawing. I didn't want the smell of poverty in my new life." He looked at the boy, his shock curdling back into a defensive rage. "Who are you? Did you dig this out of a trash heap? Did some rival company send you here to mock me with my own past?" The boy didn't blink. He didn't even look at the paper. His gaze remained fixed on the long, shadowed hallway where Sarah sat in her titanium wheelchair, her thin legs covered by a silk blanket that cost more than a small house. I watched from the shadows of the dining room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I remember the way Thomas used to pace that hallway at night, cursed by his own success. He had built walls of gold to keep the world out, but he had inadvertently built a prison for his daughter. To the world, Thomas was the titan of industry, but in that house he was a man losing a war against a ghost. Every doctor he hired was a soldier. Every experimental treatment was a new weapon. But the enemy wasn't a disease. It was a silence that had settled into Sarah's bones, a spiritual paralysis that no scalpel could reach. The doctor said the nerves are dead, kid. Thomas spat, trying to regain his footing as a man of logic. They used lasers. They used electricity. They used the best science human beings have ever invented. You're standing here in a house that has $1 million lab in the basement, telling me a girl who hasn't felt her toes in 5 years can just get up because of a piece of paper? The boy took a single step forward, and for a split second, the motion sensor lights in the foyer flickered and died, leaving them in a sudden, jarring twilight. Science is just a man trying to explain what God already decided, the boy said, his voice sounding much older than his small frame suggested. You spent 5 years trying to buy her legs back, Thomas, but you never asked for them. Thomas let out a sharp, jagged laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Ask who? The God who let that truck hit my wife. The God who watched my daughter scream until she lost her voice. I don't ask for favors. I earn them. I build them. I buy them. But as he spoke, the tension in the room shifted. From the end of the hallway, we heard a sound, a metallic click. Sarah had moved. She was steering her chair toward them, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the boy with an intensity I had never seen in her. She wasn't looking at the boy's clothes or his dirt-streaked face. She was looking at the air around him, as if she could see a light that our old eyes were no longer tuned to. Thomas felt it too. The hair on his arms stood up. He looked back at the drawing, then at the boy, then at his daughter. He was a man who lived by the sword of data, but his soul was starting to recognize a signature it hadn't seen since he was a little boy kneeling in a wooden pew. On that night, the boy whispered, when the car was spinning, you made a promise, Thomas. Do you remember what you said in the dark before the paramedics arrived? Thomas went perfectly still, his breath hitched in his throat. That was a secret he had told no one, not even the therapists, not even the whiskey he drank to sleep. He had whispered a vow into the cold night, ere as he pulled his daughter from the wreckage, a vow he had broken the moment he became successful enough to think he didn't need it anymore. I don't know what you're talking about, Thomas lied, but his eyes were wide with a terror that money couldn't soothe. The boy simply pointed toward the stairs. She can walk, Thomas, but the door to her miracle isn't locked from the outside. It's locked from within your heart. The silence that followed was suffocating. Thomas looked at his daughter, then at the boy, and for the first time, he didn't look like a millionaire. He looked like a man, standing on the edge of a cliff, realizing that the bridge he had built out of money was made of nothing but smoke. He didn't know that the real test, the true depth of his trial, was only just beginning, and the price of his daughter's first step would be the one thing he swore he would never give up. Everything was about to change, and even I could feel that the heavens were shifting, waiting for him to make a choice that no machine could ever make for him. The air in the hallway seemed to thicken, vibrating with a frequency that made the crystal chandeliers chime ever so softly. Thomas felt a cold sweat prickling his hairline. How do you know what I said that night? He gasped, his voice a ghost of the authority he usually commanded. He remembered the smell of gasoline and rain, the twisted metal, and the desperate blood-slick prayer he had screamed into the dark. If you let her live, I'll give it all away. I'll serve you. I'll be a different man. But she had lived, and as the months turned into years and his bank account grew, he had convinced himself it was the surgeons he paid, not the God he had begged, who had saved her. I know, because the wind doesn't forget her. Promise, Thomas, the boy replied, his small voice echoing as if they were standing in a cathedral rather than a modern mansion. Sarah's wheelchair rolled closer, the electric hum sounding unusually loud in the heavy silence. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the boy with a hunger that broke my heart. She hadn't spoken more than a dozen words in a month, but now her lips parted. Papa, she whispered, her voice trembling. Who is he? Why is the room glowing? Thomas whipped his head around. He didn't see a glow, not with his physical eyes, but he felt a heat radiating from the boy that made his expensive wool suit feel like lead. The tension was an invisible cord stretched to the breaking point. This was the moment of no return. He could call the police, have this intruder dragged away, and go back to his cold, sterile life of failed treatments. Or he could step into the unknown. The beast, titan of industry, was being asked to do the one thing he hated most, to surrender control. Suddenly, the front door swung open again. It wasn't the police. It was Dr. Aris Thorne, the world-renowned neurologist test, Thomas paid a retainer of $50,000 a month just to be on call. Thorne walked in, his iPad in hand, his face set in a professional scowl. "Thomas, I saw a breach on the security feed from my car. What is going on? Who is this child?" He didn't wait for an answer, stepping between Thomas and the boy with the practiced arrogance of a man who believed only in what he could see under a microscope. "Get this kid out of here. Sarah has a session with the exoskeleton prototype in 10 minutes. We don't have time for whatever this is." But the boy didn't move. He looked at the doctor, then back at Thomas. "He can give her wires and motors, Thomas, but he can't give her life. Only you can do that by keeping the word you gave in the wreckage." Thorne scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "This is psychological manipulation. Thomas, look at the scans. The spinal cord is severed. It's a physical impossibility. There is no word or promise that can bridge a 2-inch gap in human tissue. It's biology, not a fairy tale." The room felt like it was splitting in two. On one side, the cold, hard truth of the scans and the millions of dollars in equipment. On the other, a small boy and a crumpled drawing of a lighthouse. I saw Thomas look at his daughter. Sarah reached out a frail hand toward the boy, her fingers brushing the air as if trying to catch a spark. "I want to try, Papa," she sobbed. "I don't want the machine. I want to stand." The conflict in Thomas's eyes was agonizing to watch. To believe the boy meant admitting his entire life for the last 5 years had been a lie. It meant admitting he couldn't buy his way out of his pain. He looked at Dr. Thorne, then at the boy, and finally he looked at the drawing of the lighthouse. He took a deep, shuddering breath and stepped toward the boy, turning his back on the doctor and the millions of dollars of technology. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice cracking with a humility I thought he had buried decades ago. The boy smiled, and for a second I could swear his eyes reflected a light that didn't come from any lamp in that house. "You have to take the first step so she can take hers." Thomas nodded, his face pale but determined. He was choosing a path that defied every law of medicine he had ever been taught. And as he reached out to take the boy's hand, the very ground beneath the mansion seemed to hum with an ancient power. He didn't know it yet, but the storm that had started in that foyer was about to wash away everything he thought he knew about the world. And it was when everything seemed most impossible that something truly terrifying and beautiful began to happen. The atmosphere in the room shifted from a heavy chill to a vibrating golden warmth that seemed to emanate from the floorboards themselves. Dr. Thorne stood frozen, his iPad slipping from his numb fingers and clattering onto the marble, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of glass. He tried to speak, to call for the guards, but his voice died in his throat. Thomas didn't even glance at him. He was looking at his daughter, whose face was flushed with a color she hadn't carried since the night of the crash. "You must prepare the way, Thomas," the boy said, his voice steady and calm. "A miracle isn't a magic trick. It's an invitation. You built this house as a fortress against your God, thinking your walls and your gold could keep the pain out, but they only kept the healing from coming in." The boy pointed to the massive soundproof glass doors that led to the $1 million rehabilitation wing, the room filled with cold steel, robotic harnesses, and monitors that beeped with clinical indifference. "Open the doors, all of them, and turn off the machine. You cannot walk on water if you're still holding onto the boat." Thomas hesitated. Those machines were his lifeline, his only hope for 5 long years. To turn them off felt like surrendering his daughter to the shadows. But then he looked at Sarah. She wasn't looking at the robots anymore. She was staring at the boy with a focused spiritual hunger. Thomas walked to the control panel on the wall. His hand hovered over the master kill switch. "If I do this," he whispered, "and nothing happens, she'll be broken. Forever." "She's already broken, Thomas," I said from the doorway, unable to stay silent any longer. He looked at me, startled, and for a moment he saw not just his housekeeper, but the woman who had prayed for him every single night while he was busy counting his billions. "The machines are just keeping the pieces together. Let God make her whole." With a trembling hand, Thomas slammed the switch. The hum of the mansion died. The blue surgical lights flickered out, replaced by the soft, natural amber of the setting sun streaming through the high windows. The silence that followed was absolute, a sacred, expectant hush. If you're feeling the weight of this moment and believe that sometimes we have to let go of our own strength to find a higher power, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because what happened in that silence was something no medical textbook could ever document. The boy walked to the center of the foyer and knelt. "Thomas, kneel with me, not as a billionaire, as a son who finally came home." Thomas Whitmore, a man who hadn't bent his knees for anything or anyone in 30 years, slowly lowered himself onto the cold marble. He put his head in his hands and began to do something he thought he had forgotten how to do. He didn't offer money. money. He didn't bargain. He simply whispered, "I am sorry. I remember the promise. I am yours." As he spoke those words, a soft breeze began to stir inside the sealed house. It smelled of ozone and sea salt, the exact scent of the coastline where the old lighthouse stood. Sarah's wheelchair began to vibrate, not from a motor, but from a power that seemed to be rising from the earth itself. Her legs, once pale and thin, began to twitch. A faint, rhythmic thumping started in the room, the sound of a heart beating so loud it echoed off the walls. The boy stood up and looked at Sarah. "The debt is paid, and the promise is kept." He turned back to Thomas, whose eyes were streaming with tears. "Watch closely, Thomas, for the heavens have been waiting for this moment longer than you have." Thomas gripped the edge of his daughter's chair, his knuckles white. He could feel the air around Sarah's leg beginning to shimmer like heat over a desert road. "Mal sabiam eles que o milagre já estava liberado nos céus," and the world was about to witness what happens when a father's pride finally breaks under the weight of his faith. The silence in the foyer was no longer empty. It was electric, a living thing that pulsed with every heartbeat. Thomas felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a child, a peace so thick it felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. He looked at Sarah and his breath hitched. The shimmer around her legs was intensifying, a soft golden luminescence that seemed to originate from within her very bones. "Sarah," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion that no boardroom victory could ever provide. The little boy stepped toward the wheelchair. He didn't use force. He didn't even touch her. He simply held out his hand, palm upward, as if inviting her to a dance. "The silence is over, Sarah. The Father heard your heart when your father's ears were closed. Stand up." Dr. Thorne made a sudden, strangled sound of protest, but he couldn't move. It was as if the air itself had become solid around him, a divine barrier protecting the moment. Sarah's hands gripped the armrests of her titanium chair. Her knuckles were white, but her face wasn't twisted in the usual mask of localized pain and frustration. It was radiant. Slowly, impossibly, her feet, which had limp for 5 long years, slid flat onto the marble floor. Thomas felt the world tilt. He watched, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and awe, as the muscles in her calves began to ripple. A soft, rhythmic glow pulsed from her spine, traveling down her legs like a wave of liquid light. I feel it." "Papa," Sarah sobbed, her voice ringing clear and strong. "It's warm. It feels like the sun is inside my knees." Then, with a grace that defied every law of physics and every medical scan Dr. Thorne had ever produced, Sarah began to rise. There was no mechanical whir, no hydraulic hiss, no trembling of weak muscles. She stood with the steadiness of an oak tree. The heavy silk blanket slid from her lap, pooling on the floor like a discarded cocoon. Thomas fell to his knees again, but this time it wasn't out of grief. It was out of pure, unadulterated worship. He saw his daughter, standing tall, her eyes level with his own for the first time in half a decade. The golden light flared once, illuminating the entire mansion with a brilliance that made the expensive chandeliers look like dim embers, and then it settled into her skin, leaving her glowing with health. Sarah took a step, then another. The sound of her bare feet hitting the marble was the most beautiful music Thomas had ever heard. She walked toward him, her gait perfect, her strength undeniable. She reached out and touched his face with a hand that was no longer cold and pale, but warm and vibrating with light. "You're back, Papa," she whispered. "We're both back." The little boy stood by the door, his shadow stretching long across the floor, looking not like a child, but like a guardian of the ages. He looked at the miracle he had brokered, and then at Thomas, who was clutching his daughter's waist, weeping into her stomach. The doctor was staring at the empty wheelchair, his mouth hanging open, his scientific world shattered into a billion pieces. He reached out to touch the chair, as if to prove it was still there, but his hand stopped mid-air. He looked at Sarah, then at the boy, and finally at the sky visible through the high windows. But as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the room in a soft, holy twilight, Thomas realized something. The miracle of the legs was only the beginning. Mas o que aconteceu depois do milagre foi ainda mais surpreendente, and it would require a sacrifice Thomas hadn't even considered yet. The golden light that had filled the room didn't fade so much as it settled, sinking into the very walls of the mansion until the air itself felt sanctified. Sarah didn't just stand. She walked with a lightness that seemed to defy gravity, her bare feet pressing against the cold marble that had once been her prison floor. Thomas remained on his knees, his face buried in his daughter's waist, his tears soaking into her dress. For the first time in 5 years, the titan of industry was small enough to finally see the truth. He looked up, expecting to see the the little boy standing by the Ming vase, but the foyer was empty. The heavy oak doors were still bolted from the inside. The security alarms, which should have been screaming at an opened exit, remained silent. Only the crumpled drawing of the lighthouse remained, fluttering slightly in a breeze that shouldn't have existed in a sealed house. Dr. Thorne was slumped against a pillar, his face ashen, staring at Sarah's legs as if waiting for them to vanish. He was a man of equations who had just seen a variable he couldn't name. "He's gone," Sarah whispered. Sarah whispered, a voice sounding like a bell. She reached down and picked up the drawing. "But he said to tell you, Papa, the lighthouse only works if the light is shared." In the weeks that followed, the world went into a frenzy. Medical journals demanded interviews. Scientists begged to examine Sarah's spontaneous remission. Thomas Whitmore, the man who once controlled the media with a snap of his fingers, refused them all. He didn't need a lab report to tell him what his heart already knew. He began to change, and the transformation was more shocking than the miracle itself. I watched as the man who worshipped gold began to dismantle his empire. He didn't just give money, he gave himself. He sold the mansion, the mausoleum of his pride, and used the billions to build a network of clinics and shelters along the very coastline where he had grown up. He rebuilt the old parish, not with marble and gold, but with open doors and warm hearths. He realized that his daughter hadn't been paralyzed by a car crash. She had been paralyzed by his refusal to be the man he promised to be. Sarah never used that wheelchair again. In fact, Thomas kept it in the center of his new, modest home, not as a trophy of pain, but as a reminder of the silence that God had broken. He became a man of the streets, often seen sitting with the homeless, looking into their eyes not with pity, but with a search for the boy who had saved his soul. He learned that the greatest miracle wasn't that Sarah could walk, it was that he could finally feel. The lesson he left for all of us is one I carry in my old bones to this day. We spend our lives building walls to protect ourselves from the world, thinking our strength is measured by what we own, but true power is found in the moment we break. God doesn't wait for us to be perfect, He waits for us to be honest. He doesn't need our bank accounts, He needs our surrendered hearts. The miracle didn't happen because Thomas was rich enough to deserve it. It happened because he was finally poor enough to ask for it. If this story has touched your spirit and reminded you that no silence is too deep for God to reach, please subscribe to the channel and join our community of faith. There are mysteries in this world that money cannot solve, and sometimes the answer you've been searching for is already standing at your door, waiting for you to simply let it in. As for Thomas, he still carries that drawing of the lighthouse in his pocket, and every time he looks at his daughter running through the grass, he remembers that the heavens never forget a promise. Even when we do, the light is still shining, and as long as you believe, the next miracle might just be yours.